Welcome to the Theological Lens, where our goal is to see the world, our daily walks, and our worship transformed by the truth of Jesus Christ. Our content is saturated with Scripture, overflowing with faith, and rooted in the good news of the cross. Each episode will proclaim the name of the Lord, calling us to submit to His ways and live lives that glorify Him. With hearts full of thankfulness, we'll explore how Jesus shapes everything, our decisions, our worldview, and our worship, always pointing back to the hope and transformation found in Him.
Hello, and welcome to the Theological Lens. My name is Dr. Lynelle Buchanan, and I am so glad that you have joined me today. With every episode of this podcast, we work to examine culture and psychology and counseling and current events through the lens of Scripture. And today, I think we need to start with some full disclosure, maybe some informed consent, because I don't think this episode is going to be light listening. I don't think it's something that's comfortable. And it is something that maybe will elevate your blood pressure the way it elevates mine. But this conversation, I think, is really necessary because although this problem is not new, it is something that I see getting worse all the time. So we're going to talk about something that should disturb any sane member of society, the growing sexualization of children in our Western culture. And I want to be very, very clear from the outset. This is not merely about bad entertainment choices or questionable parenting or isolated examples of moral decline. I think what we are witnessing is something much, much deeper. It's an ideological movement that is dismantling the concept of childhood innocence itself. And where I used to believe that people with this agenda employed a certain craftiness that let them fly under the radar, I don't believe that that's what's happening today. There doesn't seem to be any attempt whatsoever to mask their efforts. And instead, I think that there are some people who seem to be working hard to not notice that this is happening. That's kind of sad. So Christians have to recognize this for what it is. It is not simply a cultural trend. It is a spiritual and a moral crisis where the evil and cowardice of adults is being allowed to leak onto children who bear the scars of that evil, who bear the scars of that cowardice. And I'm not okay with it. So let's start with some background. For most of human history, our civilizations have recognized something that's pretty fundamental. Children are vulnerable and they need to be protected. Childhood was viewed as a sacred developmental stage and not merely a small version of adulthood, but it was something that should be protected. And that meant that we established certain norms and even laws. Those would include things like child labor laws and strict rules about TV and movie content. The Hays Code, which governed television between the mid-1900s and 1968, restricted kisses on screen to fewer than 3 seconds. And it required that married couples under most circumstances had to have twin beds. Couldn't have them in the same bed. Fun fact on that one, it was somewhat groundbreaking when the Brady Bunch put Mike and Carol in the same bed. Now, please note, in all of those scenes, they were sitting up and holding magazines. But there was just a recognition that there are some things that shouldn't be on TV where kids could be watching. And in the 1970s, broadcasters agreed that that early evening hour, typically between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night, was intended to feature programming that would be very family friendly, that kids could watch with their families. So the restrictions on that included no sexual contact, limited violence, and even the avoidance of controversial adult issues. Why? Because kids were still awake and they would save that more adult content for after the kids likely had gone to sleep. So although that policy would later face some legal challenges, it reflected a strong cultural expectation that broadcast television should remain safe for younger audiences. There was a recognition that children are uniquely vulnerable to corruption. Their moral framework is still forming. Their understanding of their identity is still developing. Their trust is easily exploited. So historically, societies understood that protecting children meant guarding their innocence. Now, this is something that we even see reinforced in Scripture because Jesus himself spoke with remarkable seriousness about the protection of children. In Matthew 18:6, he warns, Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. That is not gentle language. That's the strongest warning that Jesus gives about any category of sin. Why? Well, because children are uniquely vulnerable to corruption. Their moral framework is still forming. Their understanding of their identity is still being developed. Their trust is easily exploited. But our culture increasingly treats innocence not as something precious that should be guarded, but instead as something that is oppressive, something that must be dismantled, something that must be liberated. And that ideological shift has consequences. In recent years, a disturbing theme has appeared in academic and activist and media kinds of circles. Children are increasingly portrayed as not as developing moral beings, but as already sexual beings whose sexuality must be explored and identified and affirmed. And we can see this in multiple places. We see this in education, where schools have pushed sex ed younger and younger ages and stocked their libraries full of explicit books. We see it in various forms of entertainment, where little girls are dressed in revealing attire and are presented in sexually available kinds of ways. We see it in social media, where sexual predators are running amok in the chat rooms of Roblox. But perhaps the most revealing statements come when activists say the quiet part out loud. One of the most widely circulated examples of that came from gender activist and performer, Alec Vaid-Manan. He was involved in a controversial social media post during debates over bathroom legislation. And this is what he posted. He said, quote, "These days, the narrative is that freaky transgender people will come into your bathrooms and abuse innocent little girls. There are no fairy tales and no princesses here. Little girls are also queer, trans, kinky, deviant, kind, mean, beautiful, ugly, tremendous, and peculiar. Your kids aren't as straight and narrow as you think they are." Let's just pause on that for a minute. Little girls are queer, trans, kinky, deviant. What's the value of describing girls in that way? Oh, then it's justified when adults treat them as if they are kinky or deviant. And if you have any functioning moral instincts, there should be alarm bells going off in your brain right now, because that is the very definition of a red flag, a huge, monstrous red flag. Now, to be fair, Vaid-Manan later said that, oh, that wording was written by a collaborator in his art collective. That didn't make it any better for me. And in fact, it is comments like these that led to the formation of a group called Gays Against Groomers. They noted that far too often, people who identify within the LGBTQ world seem to endorse early sexualization, and they did not want to be associated with that. But whether personally or collaboratively, the statement that Alok Vaid-Manan made reflects something deeper in the ideology surrounding gender activism. This concept that children already possess sexual identities that should be explored and affirmed, no matter how young they are. And once that idea enters the bloodstream of a culture, then the protective boundaries that should surround childhood begin to erode. You might wonder, how did we get to a place where statements like his can circulate at all? Well, the roots go back decades. The sexual revolution of the 1960s did more than just change adult behavior. It redefined sexuality. Sex stopped being understood primarily as covenantal. It doesn't have to be just restricted to marriage. It stopped being primarily procreative, because abortion on demand can remove the consequences so you can have all the sex you want without having to risk your lifestyle. And it certainly doesn't have to be relational, because Tina Turner asked, what's love got to do with it? And certainly sex doesn't have to be morally grounded, because only prudes would restrict it. And in fact, the hippies felt morally superior when they shouted slogans saying, "Make love, not war." Instead, sex has come to be understood as liberation, its expression, its authenticity, its identity. And once sexuality becomes identity, then something else happens. There's a demand that it be affirmed everywhere, and that includes in children. You see this clearly in contemporary activism because children are increasingly encouraged to identify their sexual orientation, identify their gender identity, experiment with sexual expression and sexual behaviors, and reject parental authority over all of these kinds of questions. And the language that is used is always the same. It's affirmation, it's exploration, it's self-discovery. But what it really means is the absolute collapse of protected boundaries. Now, consider the entertainment industry. Music videos, streaming services, social media platforms. Far, far too often, children are presented in erotic kinds of ways. In 2020, a film called Cuties was one of the most intense cultural flashpoints of the year. The film followed an 11-year-old named Amy, who was an immigrant girl from Senegal living in a conservative Muslim family in Paris. And after her father's abandonment and her mother's struggles, she joined a group of friends who formed a dance troupe, and they called themselves the Cuties. They imitated highly sexualized twerking and provocative dance routines that they saw on social media, inspired by adult dancers, and other viral trends. And when the backlash erupted, the director repeatedly defended it as a warning about the hypersexualization of young girls in modern society, the pressures of social media, and how preteens navigate identity, femininity, and peer influence. She said she was inspired by her observation of real girls dancing sensually at a neighborhood event and her research with young people. But when Netflix released a poster and a description showing these young actresses aged 11 and 12 in crop tops and short shorts, posing provocatively while twerking, people were understandably upset. And the movie showed these young actresses dancing sensually, a pedophile's dream. But they dismissed the controversy as merely a marketing misstep. The movie wasn't the problem, just the poster. They didn't understand why people were upset. They were upset because of the sexualization and exploitation of minors. Many claimed that the film depicted 11-year-old girls, which it did, in graphic, sexualized dance sequences like twerking and suggestive poses and implied sexual acts in a way that was gratuitous and appealed to pedophilic tendencies. They argued that it normalized and glamorized child exploitation rather than critiquing it. Now, in October of 2020, a Texas grand jury actually indicted Netflix for promotion of lewd visual material depicting a child, alleging it appealed to inappropriate interest without artistic value. Now, Netflix absolutely denied this, calling it a social commentary against the sexualization of children. And the case did not lead to any major convictions. Netflix also defended themselves, saying that the depiction of that child's sexual activity doesn't equal endorsement of it. So let me get this straight. You wanted to point out the evils of sexualizing children. So you held casting calls and you chose several very young girls. You dressed them in provocative ways, taught them sexual dances, and then disseminated that to millions of viewers. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea and not exploitative at all. You can contrast that with the way that Angel Studios treated sexual trafficking in The Sound of Freedom. They brought attention to child sexual abuse without creating a pedophile's favorite video. Turns out that there are much better ways to handle that than the way Cuties did. Cuties is not as much of an anomaly as we would wish it would be. Shows targeted at a teen audience or younger center around sexual themes regularly, and they certainly intend to normalize sexual behaviors for a younger and younger audience. Just because that late 20-something actor who's portraying a 14-year-old seems mature enough for sexual activity, it doesn't mean an actual 14-year-old is ready. But these young adult sitcoms aren't the worst of the problem. Children are exposed to overt sexual and imagery earlier than any generation before this one. Researchers have repeatedly documented our early exposure problem. The average age of first exposure to online pornography is now around 10 to 12 years old, with boys closer to 10 and girls closer to 12. And that is according to multiple studies. That means many children are experiencing, they're exposed to graphic sexual content before they even reach puberty. And think about the psychological implications of that. A child's brain is still forming. Their understanding of relationships is immature. Their sense of their own self is fragile. And they're absorbing sexual imagery that is designed for adult stimulation that shapes their expectations, and it distorts what normal relational development should be. And it normalizes behaviors that historically society worked very hard to shield children from. So last week, this story broke about a crime in Miami from last summer. Two boys, now aged 12 and 13, allegedly grabbed a 12-year-old young girl, and they held her down and essayed her, forcing rocks into her mouth to keep her from screaming. Now, these boys have now been charged as adults. That's why it hit the news. And one of their fathers went on TV to complain about his son being charged as an adult because he said, after all, he's just a boy. Yes, he's just a boy. So what on earth went wrong here? I have suspicions that there's probably an influence from pornography somewhere. Another area where this shift towards sexualization appears is in our public school education. Many school systems now introduce concepts of gender identity and sexual orientation in kindergarten. Often the justification is that children must feel seen and represented. But the deeper philosophical shift is this: children are no longer treated as developing individuals who need moral formation. They're treated as fully formed sexual identities awaiting affirmation. And the difference between those two views is absolutely enormous. One approach protects childhood innocence, and the other destroys that innocence and pushes for information and exploration without consideration of developmental appropriateness. Psychologists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as adultification. It occurs when children are treated as if they possess the maturity, autonomy, or sexual awareness of adults. And this adultification has several consequences. One of them is a premature identity formation. Children feel pressure to define themselves and their sexual desires before they even understand themselves and what sexual desires are. It promotes a psychological confusion because they're forced to navigate concepts that are far beyond their developmental capacity. And it forces a loss of innocence. Now, instead of adults sacrificing to protect children, adults are preying upon children and arguing that they're doing it for the child's own good. The protective boundary between childhood and adulthood dissolves, and that boundary exists for a reason. Childhood innocence is something valuable and beautiful and worthy of our protection. And that protection is necessary because evil and selfish predators are everywhere. Tim Tebow last week was testifying before Congress, and he explained that in the last 6 months, more than 338,000 unique IP addresses in the United States were identified trading child sexual abuse images across peer-to-peer networks. 338,000 unique IP addresses. That's a lot of predators. But we aren't supposed to call them pedophiles because that's viewed as pejorative. We're supposed to use the term minor attracted persons because that bestows dignity. And while we're talking about language shifts, notice how discussions about children and sexuality, they rarely include these words anymore. Purity, modesty, innocence, restraint, virtue. Nope, we don't want those words. Those words are now treated as oppressive relics. Instead, the new vocabulary is expression and liberation and identity and authenticity. But here's the problem. A society that abandons moral language loses the ability to recognize moral danger. Everything becomes framed in terms of freedom. And freedom without wisdom is fertile ground for exploitation. I'm going to say that one more time. Freedom without wisdom is fertile ground for exploitation. So Scripture offers a radically different version for how we think about kids. In the Bible, children are described as blessings. They are described as arrows in a warrior's hand. And Jesus said this, "Let the little children come to me, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." Children are not miniature adults. They are developing souls who are entrusted to the stewardship of parents and religious communities. And that stewardship should include protection of their bodies, protection of their minds, protection of their moral imagination. The sexualization of children is therefore not just a social problem. It is a spiritual violation of stewardship. The strong are supposed to protect those who cannot protect themselves. That is a responsibility that falls to every single adult. And some Christians seem hesitant to even address these issues. They worry about sounding too political. They worry about sounding judgmental. But protecting children should never be a partisan issue. It is a moral obligation. And if the church cannot speak clearly when childhood innocence is threatened, then the church has abandoned one of its most basic responsibilities. So what should Christians do? Well, first of all, we need to recover a theology of childhood. Children are image bearers of God who require protection and formation. Scripture calls parents to train their children, to guide them with the wisdom born of their life experience and their submission to the Lord. The idea that we should just let a child declare who they are and what they desire and impose no moral structure is abjectly wrong. Even strongly held desires must still be managed. And second, parents need to exercise some discernment about media. Parents must be willing to say, no, be the bad guy. I'll let you borrow my mother's catchphrase because I'm a mean mother. That's why. Say no. Say no to unmonitored screens. Say no to unwise content from people who do not share your values. Say no to social platforms that are the wild west of moral formation. And third, engage schools wisely. I'm not saying that followers of Jesus should never allow their children to attend public school, but I am saying that parents should know what their children are being taught, and they need to recognize the subtle, pervasive influences that these ideologies can exert. Fourth, we need to teach children a biblical sexual ethic in an age-appropriate way. I'm not saying we flood them with information that they're not ready for, but not merely a don't do it. We need to point to the wonderful gift that sexuality is, such a powerful gift that God put rules around its use so that it can be a joy and not a harm. Because when we remove it from God's protective context, we can hurt ourselves and we can hurt others. As they develop, children need to come to understand why God created sexuality for covenant and for flourishing. And finally, we as adults need to model healthy adulthood. Children learn more from what adults live than what adults say. The stakes here are enormous because a culture that sexualizes children eventually loses the ability or the will to protect them. When innocence is dismissed as a myth, when sexuality becomes identity, when boundaries disappear, children become vulnerable to exploitation. And history has shown this again and again and again. Every civilization that normalizes sexualization of children eventually faced moral collapse. So today, in closing, I just want to leave you with a simple challenge. Reject the cultural lie that innocence is repression. Protect childhood, defend it, honor it. Because once a society stops protecting its children, it has already begun to lose its soul. Thank you for listening to The Theological Lens today. And if this episode helped you think more clearly about the culture around us, please consider liking it, subscribing, and even sharing it with a friend. Grace and peace to you.
If you enjoyed what you just heard, we invite you to like the episode and, if possible, leave a positive review. If you know someone who could benefit from this content, please share it on your social media. We also ask that you subscribe and follow so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. We are so glad that you chose to be with us today. We hope that you will join us again next week on The Theological Lens.